Welcome to Hope at Night, featuring Andrew Harewood, John Peckham, Q&A with our live audience, and host Anil Kanda. Today's episode: is it important to ask questions about faith? And here's your host, Anil Kanda.
A friend once asked Isidore Rabi, a Nobel Prize winner in science, how he became a scientist. Rabi replied that every day after school, his mother would talk to him about his school day. She wasn't so much interested in what he had learned that day, but she always inquired, "Did you ask a good question today?" Asking good questions, Rabi said, made me a scientist. Most of us would rather prefer to have answers than questions. Yet what do we do when we don't have the answers? Someone who has come face to face with hard questions is our next guest. He works at the Pentagon as the Deputy Chief of Chaplains in the United States Army Reserve. He also provides advice and counsel to the Chief of Army Reserve and Commanding General. And today we are honored to hear from him. Let's welcome to Hope at Night, Brigadier General Andrew Harewood. Thanks, Chaplain. Good seeing you again. Chaplain Harewood, it's good seeing you again after many years.
It's good to be with you again.
You may not remember me, but last time we met, you and I had a push-up contest.
You won?
No, you defeated me. I remember falling on the ground and still watching you doing push-ups. But what's it like working at the Pentagon? What are the experiences you had there?
So, work in the Pentagon has been unique in the sense that the Pentagon is the world's largest building. All right, it's close to 27,000 plus people that's working in the building itself. And then, of course, you have other individuals over in Crystal City in different parts of the National Capital Region. The unique thing about the Pentagon is that it is the only building on the planet where essentially you have all three mights converge on the one roof: economic might, political might, and military might, all under one roof. Because you essentially have the uniformed personnel, but you also have the civilian personnel. Uniformed personnel work for the civilian personnel, all right? The president, of course, being the ultimate commander-in-chief. And so, to a large degree, if you're into strategy, you like strategy, you get to see how all the sausage is made, you know, from the policy all the way down. So from the strategic to the operational to the tactical. And so it kind of gives you a really good azimuth, a good lens to see the whatness of the whyness, and sometimes the whyness of the whatness, if that makes any sense.
Right. You're a chaplain. Could you share with us what a chaplain does?
Well, a chaplain essentially is really someone just to really walk next to individuals through joys, through suffering, but certainly through pain. Unlike perhaps a normal pastor, where there's a very specific dogma, a chaplain really meets people where they are and not necessarily where you want them to be.
What's it like to be on the front lines of the military?
It gives you a lens to see life a little bit differently. I've often shared with individuals that what war does, and certainly what it did for me, war gave me a sense of clarity. Once I got on the other side of that particular event, I really have a very clear determination that I didn't want to do ministry the same way I did it before. Trying to really get after minor issues and not really the major issues. And so for me, being able to come almost like face to face, quite frankly, with death was clarifying.
Now, I hear there was a particular convoy incident in which you saw just you saw the grace of God upon your life. Could you share a little bit about that?
That would have been Afghanistan. That would have been 2006. I lost seven brothers that day. 11 actually. Long story short, we were going around a particular location, and there was an IED explosion. And it was only but for the grace of God that my vehicle wasn't where it was supposed to have been because of a different incident. But it was very difficult. It still is difficult. It was hard. I lost some folk, and I was myself and three other individuals were lucky.
What are the biggest challenges that take place after incidents like that?
I think one of the biggest questions that emerges over and over again is, where's God? Which in of itself is comforting, because in the assumption of the question, where is God, there's the assumption that there is a God. So what I often would share with individuals is, number one, let them feel what they're feeling, and don't tell them that what they're feeling, they shouldn't feel it, because we all process differently.
You're validating their experience.
Absolutely. That's critical. That's critical, because they're going to carry that with them for the rest of their lives. Many of our soldiers who are attempting suicide, and some of them are being successful, they're carrying some of those scars with them. It is unnatural to take a life. We were not designed to take a life. We were designed to celebrate life. And so when individuals are placed in that space where they have to take a life, they carry that with them.
That's so true. I mean, regardless of whatever veneer or appearance they have on, they seem to be okay. There's always this residual effect that's imprinted upon the soul when a life is taken.
Being able to be able to walk with individuals as they're having those types of hard life questions has been extremely exhilarating, but also very humbling.
This isn't like, pastoring at a church. You have someone who approach you and say, hey, I have a question about God. I have a question about life. The kinds of questions I imagine chaplains getting are oftentimes in reaction to situations that many servicemen and women have encountered out in the field, and then they're coming back. How do I make sense of this? A big question that's in my mind right now is, in military service, you're taught to, carry out operations, and then you obviously have people who are civilians, and then you have people who, and pardon my terms, considered the enemy. As someone who is a Bible-believing Christian, as someone who believes that Jesus died for all, how do you make sense? How do you explain how God is in the midst of combat? What do you say?
It runs to the central core of the meaning around the will to fight. All right? There must be some things in life that you're willing to die for. As one philosopher says, if a man has not found a purpose in life to die for, he's not willing to live. All right, so there must be some things in life that you're willing to die for. In this country, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. All right, you got to be able to, defend that with everything that you have. What I have shared over the past 34 plus years now is to help people to recognize that life really is what you truly make it. And for those individuals who are in that particular space, that particular mental space, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, one of the first things that we try to do is to validate where they are, not invalidate where they are. Because perception in the mind of the perceiver, that's reality. If that is that person's perceptions, then that's those realities, number one. Number two, I attempt to reframe the conversation. All right, so for example, not only Christians fight, Muslims fight, Jews fight, but you wear the uniform that says U.S. Army or U.S. Navy or U.S. whatever, U.S., you have a right to have a chaplain walk side by side in your pain, in your joys, et cetera, et cetera. So when someone finds himself in that unique space, I try to help them to recognize, number one, God is bigger than my perception of who God is. I'm very comfortable with my discomfort of all the things I don't know about God. And that comes with a sense of having to sort through that, I know I've been taught that God is this, 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 and this. But all those people who don't believe any of this, those people are God's people too. I often use the analogy of a picture on the wall. And that frame is what the Germans will call prolegomena, which means everything that I'm going to talk about God, everything I know about God is in that frame. But here's the thing, that frame is hanging on a wall. And there's another set of reality outside of the frame that is equally God as well. And so I attempt to reframe the conversation, especially if I can physically see that they're really in a space where this is they're about to have a nervous breakdown. Because when you're in combat, you're in a whole different mental space, right?
Right.
And so reframing the conversation becomes absolutely critical.
Chaplain, you have people in your sphere of influence who are making decisions that are affecting the lives of thousands, millions of people.
Mm-hmm.
Where they're making decisions on, like, do we attack? Do we drop bombs? Do we send drones in? The kinds of decisions where some people may not wake up tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
When you are counseling people, and you are communicating and sharing with them, and you mentioned obviously with soldiers, you try to reframe the conversation. What kind of counsel and advice, spiritual advice, do you give to people in high positions like those?
Right. So in my role and the chief's role, what we attempt to do is to do exactly what you just articulated, to help them to contextualize. Context gives perspective. And there are times when we are drawn into some of those decision cycles, when there's a moral or ethical piece involved. And what we attempt to do, certainly what I attempt to do, is to try to strike what I call a healthy strategic balance. All right. The greatest victory that any general could achieve is peace. All right. And so if in fact there is peace, one of the reasons why we attempt to have a very strong force is because if I know that you have a weapon pointing at me, if I cross a line, I am not going to cross that line. So you might not have to ever use the weapon, but void of the weapon, I will cross the line. What we attempt to do is to try to keep our leaders balanced morally and ethically. All we can do is advise.
That's right. When it comes to all of these kinds of situations you're encountering as a chaplain, what you say obviously has an impact upon the decisions that are being made in our nation. It's an incredible and terrible responsibility, and I feel like even as I'm talking to you, we're just getting an inkling of the great burden you bear in this role. How do you maintain faith with all that is happening, the entire nation and its struggles, and the questions that are out there? How do you maintain faith through it all?
There's a wonderful text in 1 John 3:20 that is very dear to my heart, which essentially says, when our hearts condemn us, God is bigger than our hearts. And the reason why for me that is very comforting is because cognition doesn't take place in the heart. The only thing that takes place in the heart is the exchange of blood with oxygen. So when the text is saying when our hearts condemn us, it's really talking about when our minds condemn us. God is greater than our. And so for me, I offer that not just to myself, but to other individuals when they cannot make sense, either logical sense or emotional sense, out of a situation. And because to some degree, depression is really anger turned inwardly, right? And when you've done some really bad things, or you've been a part of some really bad things, and I say bad in the sense of, although you may have justification, the thing was still bad. You took someone's father, you took someone's brother, you took someone's husband, etc., right? You live with that, you sleep with that, and it begins to percolate in your mind, and you begin to question some things about yourself. When those things begin to happen, I remind myself, God is bigger than that, you know. It might not work for somebody else, but it works for me, because I have to remind myself, it doesn't matter what I've done, where I've been, or what has happened to me. As long as I'm breathing, there's hope. And as long as there's hope, there's a chance. And as long as there's a chance, oh yeah, God is bigger than me. And I can kind of settle down.
Chaplain, thank you so much. I really appreciate your approach to life and to your role and to your calling. It's not just always about giving people the answer. It's about leading them through a process of sometimes more questions to help them to find the response. You know, as you were talking, I was just reminded of many times I've had questions in my life. And I'm so thankful that people are able to sit down and process that with that. Thank you so much. We've been talking with Chaplain Harewood on his experiences on the front lines of war and what to do when we don't have answers to our questions. Our next guest has more to add on this topic, so don't go away. Welcome back to Hope at Night. We've been talking with Chaplain Harewood on the topic of questions. Joining us next is a prominent author, professor, and theologian who has written on questioning God. Please welcome to Hope at Night, Dr. John Peckham. Good to see you. Dr. Peckham, can you share with us your journey about questions, important questions, existential questions, theological questions, the big questions, and where it has led you?
Yeah, absolutely. To make a long story short, the reason I became a theologian was because I had so many questions. And I grew up as a pastor's kid. And I remember we used to do a lot of outreach in communities, impoverished communities. And I saw so much suffering in the world. I saw so much injustice. And it really made me question, where is God in all of this? Why are these horrible things happening? And my father was quite a reader, still is. And I used to think, oh, if I go in his library, I'll find the answer in one of his books. And so I would read, and I would read, and I would read some more. And sometimes I would find an answer that satisfied me. Sometimes I wouldn't. But inevitably, it seemed like every answer I found led to more questions, right? Not that they weren't good answers, and answers that affirm my faith, but there's also more questions and many things we don't know. So long story short, I ended up becoming a theologian and studying these questions for my career, for my vocation.
Now, why is it that some churches or entities or religious organizations discourage asking too much questions?
I think one of the big reasons why some of those entities discourage questions is they find those questions threatening. They're maybe afraid of where they will lead. But what I would say to that is we should actually be, I think, thankful when people are asking questions about God, because that means they're seeking. That means they are looking. And Jesus was very clear. He said, ask and you will find, right? He said, seek and you will find. Ask and knock and the door will be open to you. And so Jesus invited these kinds of questions throughout his ministry. And in fact, all throughout the Bible, we find questions being asked, and God is not responding to them negatively. But I think what many people fear is that we won't be able to handle the questions. But what I would say is the truth can lose nothing by close investigation. God is bigger than all of our questions, and there are real answers out there. And so we should not be afraid of any questions that we might raise.
Dr. Peckham, when you break down exactly the human mind, God made us to be very curious beings, to go down the path of investigation. Why doesn't God just simply give us all the knowledge and all the information out there? Why does he lead us down a path of investigation, a process, a protracted process where questions and sometimes frustration because we're not giving answers in this, in this journey? Why does that have to be part of the very process of understanding God? Why are questions so important to understanding who God is?
Yeah, that's a big question. And I think in order to even begin to try to answer it, first we need to say, we're not God, right? And so this is also one of the questions we're going to say, well, God has answers, and we can't even begin to fathom all the reasons for why God operates the way that he operates. But I think we can say at least a couple of things, at least based on what the Bible says. First of all, the Bible is very clear that we live in a fallen world. The world is not the way it is supposed to be. Because sin and evil have entered the world, there is a distance between God and us that God doesn't want to be there. And a big part of what God is doing throughout the entire story of the Bible is to shrink that gap through the work of Christ and through the atonement. And so it wouldn't be this way, there wouldn't be this separation if it wasn't for the sin and evil that has come into the world. The second thing I would say is that if God were to treat us like robots or like machines and just give us all of the answers and download everything into our minds, we wouldn't have the kind of free will that is necessary for love. If I, per impossible, could control all of the thoughts of my wife, if I could just download into her brain whatever I want her to think, she would not be free to love me because love requires freedom. There couldn't be genuine love. And that kind of genuine freedom requires the ability to question things. We say that going all the way back to the Garden of Eden, where there is the possibility built into humans to ask questions and even to doubt God, even to question and have questions of our faith. And so that is built in to the nature of love. And God is love. So as far as I can see, it couldn't be otherwise. If God's going to create a world, a universe in which creatures are free to love him, there's going to be the possibility of doubt. That leads to questions, and that's going to involve a journey, particularly in the kind of world that we live in, where there is darkness in our world because of sin. God is working to rescue us from that darkness. But in the meantime, sometimes we can't see more than a few steps ahead.
Obviously, you're right. We do live in a broken world, a fallen world, a world that is just suffering the effects of sin and unrighteousness. We get to heaven one day. Are we still going to be asking questions of God?
Yes. So we're always going to be having questions because I think it's part of our nature to ask questions, to be inquisitive, to want to know more. It's part of human nature, the way God has designed us. And I could never imagine a time when we would get to the point where we have all of the answers. Why? Because in order to have all of the answers, you would have to be omniscient to know everything. But only God knows everything. And so there will be literally an eternity of investigation, of discovery. I mean, some people say, oh, heaven sounds very boring, like nothing will happen. Quite the opposite. There will be an endless universe to explore and a creator who has created things beyond our imagining. And we find that it's in the nature of God also to welcome questions all throughout the Bible. There are people that are afraid to ask God questions, think, oh, who can question God? But in the Bible, you have characters, major characters like Moses, who questions God in the midst of suffering. He says, for instance, God called Moses to go and tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. And Moses goes. And things get worse for the people of Israel. So Moses cries out to God and said, why did you call me? Why did you bring me here? Things are even worse. Then after the Exodus, the people cry out, we're going to die out here in the wilderness. Why did you bring us here? And God doesn't respond to their questions by scolding them. He actually works with them. He welcomes their questions. In the New Testament, you have John the Baptist, the person who Jesus said there was never a prophet greater than him. And yet at the end of his life, he is languishing in prison. Herod puts him in prison, and he questions Jesus. He sends a message to him. Are you the one we were looking for, or should we look for another? And God doesn't judge him for that. He knows his heart. He welcomes those questions. But John the Baptist goes through that. And supremely, I think the greatest question in the Bible is on the lips of Jesus himself, where he is hanging on the cross, and he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Now that's really fascinating. You just opened up another can of worms. Lots of questions here. You just talked about when Jesus was on the cross, and here's the Messiah, here's the Son of God, here's God incarnate, and he is been led to the cross, and he understands the plan of salvation better than anyone. He understands the Father better than anyone. Mm-hmm. Why did he, on the cross, ask God this very question, why, God, have you forsaken me? It seems kind of strange when, you have Jesus, who is the light of the world, asking this very question in this moment of pain and suffering on the cross. Why did he question God on the cross?
Yeah. Here we need to recognize, first of all, that the Father had not forsaken him. He had not been forsaken of God. He asked this question, though, because in his humanity, he is going through suffering beyond anything that we can imagine. And even before he's on the cross, if you go back in the Gospels, you read about Christ praying in Gethsemane. He prays to the Father. He says, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. And this cup was the suffering. If there's any other way to save the world, let me not have to go through this. But then he says, not my will, but your will be done. And the book of Hebrews says it was for the joy set before him that he endured the cross. It wasn't something he wanted, but he wanted something greater, and that was to save the world. And this was the only way to save the world. So as Jesus is hanging on that cross, he can't see through the darkness. He has all the sins, all the weight of the sins of the world on his shoulders. And so he's crying out to God. But that question actually is not a question original to Jesus. He is quoting in that question from one of the Psalms of Lament. Psalm 22, and it's a major genre in the Psalms, of lament Psalms, people crying out to God, why have you done this? It's in the Bible, which tells us it's okay to lament. It's okay to ask questions. And Jesus quotes this Psalm, Psalm 22, which begins with these words, my God, why have you forsaken me? But the end of that Psalm actually ends in triumph. It's actually a Psalm of lament that also recognizes faith. So Jesus is questioning not in a way that he lost his faith in the Father. He's actually quoting from a Psalm of lament and pouring out his heart of what he is going through, that only the Father can carry him through. And he also has faith that he will carry him through, even though he can't see it experientially at the moment, in the moment of the greatest darkness possible.
What you're describing is really fascinating, because even Jesus, in the midst of suffering, quoting from Psalm 22, why, God, have you forsaken me, tells us something about the nature of suffering. Inherent to suffering is the question to God, why?
Yes.
Why is this happening?
Yes.
And the very fact that Jesus himself entered into that very experience tells us how much he took on humanity.
Yes.
That he himself cried out, why?
Yes.
Why is this happening?
Yes.
Why does the human heart crave answers in the midst of suffering?
I think in the midst of suffering, everyone needs something to hold on to. We all want answers to life's ultimate questions. And it's not just the question of suffering. We have all these big questions that are very difficult to answer. What's the meaning of life? What is my purpose? But I think in the midst of suffering, when we're going through evil, that's when the rubber hits the road, maybe in the strongest way. Like, is everything meaningless? Does anything really matter? Is there really a God? And I think that we need to recognize at this juncture, when we're asking these questions, that, as you said, Jesus himself modeled this for us already as our example. And Jesus himself is the ultimate figure in a long lines of figures in the Bible of people who went through undeserved suffering. And one of the greatest examples is Job. He goes through all of this undeserved suffering, so much that he cries out to God and questions God and says, God, you've been cruel to me. I wish I was never born. And finally, at the end of the book, a number of events happen, but he has a conversation with God. And God doesn't scold him. God says that Job did not, he says of Job's friends, they spoke what was not right of me, because they all said, oh, this must be happening to you, Job, because you deserve it, because you've done something wrong. You've done something that God is judging you for. Job knew that wasn't the answer. He hadn't done anything to deserve this. And at the end, God says they had spoken what was not right of him, but of God. But he doesn't say the same thing of Job. But what he does say to Job is he says, who are you? Right? Were you there when I created the world? Who is this in Job 38? God says, who is this who darkens counsel with words without knowledge. And in one translation of that verse, it says, why do you talk so much when you know so little? And in that encounter, Job recognizes how little he knows. And he actually says, I spoke of things that I did not understand, things too wonderful for me. And so there's always a point where we have to recognize that God is bigger than our questions. And when we're suffering and asking the deepest questions, one thing we can hold on to is that when we suffer, God suffers with us, whenever anyone suffers. When my son, he was 5 at the time, he broke his arm, I would have rather broken my arm. And I think he recovered from that sooner than my wife and I did, not just physically, but emotionally. But it's even more so with God, because all of us are God's children. And he loves us more than we can possibly imagine. And whenever we suffer, he suffers with us. And when it seems like God is the farthest from us, he's actually the closest to us. And in the end, in the new earth, we will be able to see that, see the end from the beginning, and recognize God was with us, just as he was with Christ on the cross.
Now, what you're describing is it's very interesting, because a lot of the questions that you see in the Bible, I mean, there are people who are very inquisitive, and then there are people who are very skeptical, right? Mm-hmm. When do questions, according to you, when do questions no longer have any benefit to us?
Yeah. Probably most of us have heard the saying, there's no such thing as a bad question. And I think that saying is true if the question is asked in a spirit of actually seeking the answer. I think a question becomes a problem when it's used as a weapon. Okay? So God is always big enough to handle all of our questions. It'd be silly to say, I'm not going to raise my question with God that's in my mind. He already knows what's in your mind, right? He already knows if you're questioning. So there's no point in trying to withhold that from him, right? You can bring it to him. He's got big shoulders, so to speak. He can handle all of our questions. But to try to hide it from him is kind of like playing hide and seek with my son when he was young. And he'd hide behind a tree and be like, "Oh, Daddy, you can't see me," but I can see him, right? The tree's not covering up. Right. I know exactly where he is. God knows all of our questions already, and so we have nothing to fear from bringing our questions to God. He can handle our questions, whatever they may be.
And what you're pointing out is it's important to be in this evaluation of our own motives behind the questions. Are we genuinely interested in the answer?
Yes.
And when the answer comes, are we prepared to accept that answer, whatever it may be, right?
That's right. So you can wrestle with God, even as Jacob wrestled with God in Genesis. But the key is not to try to wrestle him away. So if your questions are like a weapon, and sometimes people do raise questions, it's like a defensive. They don't really want the answer, because even if you answer that question, there's another question, there's another question. And it's not bad that there's another question, but the questions are really to deflect. The questions are really to move away. They're really like to wrestle God away. But what Jacob did, when he's wrestling with God, is he refuses to let go. And I think that's the key when we're asking questions. They should be asked in the spirit of good faith, in the spirit of trying to seek the answer. And if we're trying to seek the answer, again, we are told that if you ask, it will be given to you. This is a promise from Christ. Maybe not now. That doesn't mean we'll understand everything right now. But enough will be given if we seek the one who has all the answers and recognize that we do not have all the answers. We could not possibly have all the answers, and we shouldn't expect it to be otherwise. That's part of God's answer to Job. Do you know all of these things? Of course I don't know all of these things. But God knows more than we could possibly ever imagine. And a good question is whatever question that is asked when we're actually seeking the answer. And God welcomes all of those questions.
Dr. Peckham, I got one more question for you, and I'm not sure if you can answer it.
Probably not.
Is there a question God cannot answer?
I think there are questions God cannot answer, but they're of the kind that go against God's character. So there's no informational question he couldn't answer, but there are questions like, who do you not love? For whom would you not die? Right? God's love is so great that if there was just one sinner that Christ that had to go through the cross to die for, he would have gone through it for that person. So those kinds of questions, there's no answer to, but when it comes to informational, God knows everything, right? 1 John 3:20, God knows all things.
You know, it's really interesting when you're reading the book of Revelation, and you know, you have this sort of end time scenario where the lost come before God, and you know, there's this dialogue of some kind that happens. We don't know what the dialogue is precisely, but it comes to this place where, you know, every knee shall bow. You know, in other words, there's acknowledgement at the end of the day that God was just and true in his actions, right? Is there questions in our universe? It's not that God doesn't want to answer. It's because there is no answer to this question. Are there things like that?
There are things like that, and the number one question like that is the question of the origin of evil itself. Why would anyone ever rebel against a good and loving God? And that is referred to in theology as the mystery of iniquity. Because to do something evil, to introduce evil, is actually irrational. It is anti-love. One way of defining evil is that which is against love. And why would anybody do that? Particularly the angel who fell and became Satan. Why would anybody fall from perfection and do that? And we can talk about how it happened, turning inward, becoming selfish. But why someone would make that decision, to try to answer that would end up excusing it, when in fact there is no rational reason for that kind of decision. And that kind of question cannot be answered because it lies in the individual who makes that decision freely. But God's justice and his character and his righteousness, that he has done everything that could be done, every step of the way for the best good of all concerned, that can not only be answered, but it can be demonstrated. It was demonstrated first at the cross, supremely at the cross, and it will be demonstrated in the next life when we're able to see, when God shows us the end from the beginning, and we can see everything he has done, why he has done it, and that he always and only had everyone's best interest in mind.
This conversation begs more questions. But it's been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Peckham. We've been asking questions about asking questions with theologian and author Dr. John Peckham. Up next, it will be our studio audience's turn to ask questions about asking questions, so don't go away. Welcome back to Hope at Night. We've been talking about the role of asking questions when it comes to God and faith. Right now, we're going to turn to our studio audience to see what questions they have for our guests. We have any questions? Right over there.
Chaplain, this question is for you. You mentioned several deployments throughout your career. While you were deployed, what exactly were your responsibilities? Did you preach, pray, counsel, or were you yourself armed and fighting on the front lines?
So you've asked 5 questions. I'll start with the last first. So no, I do not carry a weapon. We have individuals who actually travel with us. They used to be called chaplain's assistants. They're now called spiritual advisors, but they're the ones who actually carry the weapons. That's number one. Number 2, all the above: preach, teach, counsel. I can still remember that. I can still remember when the order was given to push, north. I can still remember my sermon. It was 7 words: God will take care of you, always. So yes, preach, teach, counsel. Very often there are a lot of individuals who have questions. Why am I here? Things happen back at home. They get bad news, and they want to talk about it. They want to process it. So all the above.
Right, and Chaplain, we know that suicide rates definitely have progressed, just really high with a lot people who have been in combat. Mm-hmm. And so the role of a chaplain is, it's a lot there, but extremely necessary in helping people navigate through what they experienced.
And the reality is that, it's kind of oxymoronic, but people who attempt suicide really don't want to hurt themselves or kill themselves. It's a cry for help. They're in a space that is numb. It is painful, and the ambivalence of, do I go, do I stay, do I go, do I? And so some individuals would attempt, with some less lethal methods, i.e. pills. You can pump them. You put a weapon to your head to pull the trigger, you're not coming back. All right? But, so pain is pain, the same way how you can fall and break an arm. People's emotions break. And when that happens and they don't have that resilient foundation, they begin to question not only God, but they begin to question the sense of purpose. They begin to question, why am I here? What am I doing?
Their own value.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And then when that resource, which should be at home, has been taken, very often when we get that bad news, that's when everything shatters, because the only hope that the soldier really is holding on to from leaving, doing what they're doing, is when they're going to reunite, right? And then when they get home, there's nothing to reunite to. And so it becomes very real. It becomes very real.
Thank you for sharing with us. Any other questions? Right over there.
Hi, I have a friend that did a 15-year sentence in prison for taking a life, and it was not for a noble cause. What kind of godly advice do you have for people like that?
As I mentioned in one of the earlier segments, taking another person's life is always haunting. In this life, in the world, we have what we call conventions. Conventions are, I just can't walk up to you and do whatever I want to you because I would break one of those conventions. We call them laws, right? And so once a law is broken, once a convention is broken, there must be a consequence. And so in this society, you take a life, there's a penalty. You rip someone, there's a penalty. You steal, there's a penalty. So the advice that I would have for him clearly would be one of, number one, there's always redemption. The theme of God is redemption. And sometimes there's something called tough love. And sometimes the hardest person that we can forgive is ourselves. So he took a life, but he still has life. And so there is a redemptive process whereby the conversation I would really have with him would be, now that you still have your life, when you have completed your 15-year sentence, and you might not do the whole 15 years, but the point being, when you now have your freedom again, how will you reconcile your actions from taking a life and know what you're going to do with your life to impact other lives? That would be really the conversation I would actually have with him, reframing his present situation, because right now he's questioning everything, and he knows that what he did was incorrect. So having that conversation is futile. It's irrelevant. No one needs to be reminding him of the bad thing he's done. He does that every single night. What he does need some encouragement with. So when you visit with him, when you talk with him, help him to reframe. Okay, so what are you going to do now as a result of what you've done? There are 5 basic questions that we matriculate through in life. Who am I? What do I do? What do I want? How do I plan to get it? What am I going to do with it? Most people get stuck at the first one primarily because they're confused. Who am I with what do I do? Andrew's who I am. A general, that's what I do. Professor, that's what I do. Those are titles. What he's wrestling with right now in that cell is, who am I? And I did a really, really bad thing. All right? But there's redemption. There's reconciliation. And so when you're visiting with them, when you're talking with them, those are the kinds of themes that you want to stay on. Is that helpful?
Beautiful. Any other questions? Right over there.
Hi, Dr. Peckham. You had stated that God is love, and I feel that is true literally. Do you think most religions anthropomorphize attributing genitalia and or sexual identity in a human projection to God as a way to make it easier to identify with that God? Or do you think that God is actually a man?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I would say is that the God of the universe, outside of the incarnation, when the Son of God actually became a man, Jesus of Nazareth, outside of that God has no sex. God has no gender. So you have what are typically thought of as masculine characteristics that are spoken of God, only good characteristics, not any of the bad or sinful ones. But you also have characteristics that are more commonly associated with femininity, or even just female imagery. So you have the imagery of a hen who gathers her chicks under her wings. That's one of the images that's used of God, because God is beyond sex and gender. He doesn't have genitalia. He's beyond this conception. But he has all of the best characteristics of what we would describe outside of the actual sexual characteristics of maleness and femaleness. And actually, the Bible is clear in Genesis 1 that God made humans in his image. And then it says, male and female, he created them in his image. So it would be a mistake to say, again, outside the incarnation, that God is one or the other at the level of sex or gender.
Any other questions? Right over there.
Do you believe that we are alone in the universe? And if so, or if not, what do you think that says about God wanting to make life abundant, or about the uniqueness of the human consciousness?
I'm going to let him take that.
So I do not think we are alone. The Bible doesn't talk much about this issue, but it does make very clear that beyond our world there is not just God, but there are also the angels, and also fallen angels, and that there is more going on than meets the eye, both in our world and beyond our world. Additionally, there's some scenes throughout Scripture that some scholars refer to as heavenly council scenes. Like in the book of Job, you have this scene where Satan comes to where God is, and the sons of God are there to present themselves. And so, we don't really know exactly who those sons of God are, but some people think that they're representatives of other worlds in this kind of like heavenly courtroom scene. So the information we have is partial, which is often the case when it comes to big questions and things of God. But what we have suggests that there is life out there more than just God, other creatures. And I think it does point to the fact that God is love, that there's a universe beyond our imagining, that it also seems likely, I don't want to speculate, I'm not God, there are many things I don't know, but it seems likely that a God of love would create much more than what we see within the limits of our solar system or the furthest that our telescopes can reach.
What does that tell us even more about the plan of redemption? Does the fact that we live in a bigger universe in some way diminish the plan of redemption, or does it enhance the bigger picture and the moves that are made within the plan of redemption?
Yeah, I think it actually enhances it. So Paul writes about this, and he describes what he has gone through and the other apostles have gone through, and he says that we are like a spectacle or a theater to men and to angels, suggesting that there is an entire universe that is looking on more than just what is happening on this earth. And the plan of redemption, Paul also describes in cosmic terms, that all of creation groans. And I think that extends to the entirety of the universe that is affected by the questions that are raised on our planet with sin and evil, that God is working to answer through the plan of redemption. And so what Christ does to save us is not just to save me individually, although it is, not just to save this world, although it is, but is to actually redeem the cosmos and to inoculate the universe such that evil will never rise again.
Any other questions? Right over there.
The Bible mentions a great war in heaven. My question to you is why would someone want to go to a place where there was a great war? Couldn't war happen in heaven again?
Yeah, it's interesting that you frame that question that way, because I might think, I can imagine that I might think if I was in heaven, why would they let any of us in when we've already shown our true colors? But I think to the point of your question, that's one of the reasons why God is dealing with the problem of evil the way that he is. through, not by force, not by power. If that was the case, the conflict would be over immediately. But he's doing it through a demonstration of his righteousness and a demonstration of his love. And Paul talks about this very clearly in Romans 3 and Romans 5. And the way God does this supremely through the cross and beyond, showing that God truly is love and God truly is good, actually defeats all of the allegations against God's character, the questions that were referred to earlier that were raised about his justice. All of these are answered in a way that will eventually satisfy everyone, so that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Christ is Lord, and everyone will recognize that God is righteous and just. And this demonstration through the plan of redemption, supremely through the cross, effectively inoculates the universe so that everyone sees just how evil sin is, and no one will ever want it to rise again, and it never will rise again. And we can be sure of that, at least to the extent that we have faith in the Bible, which I do, because the Bible promises that sin will never rise again. And God can know this with certainty because he knows the end from the beginning. So from a human vantage point, it looks like, oh, maybe this could be a repeating cycle. But God promises us in his infinite wisdom that it will not rise again, and he has done everything that is necessary to effectively inoculate the universe from this ever taking place again, so that this controversy will be ended once and for all, not through force, but ultimately through love and righteousness.
What you're presenting is really fascinating because it seems like the dilemma of God is, how do you secure the universe from another rebellion, another planet Earth, another insurrection from happening without violating the choices of his creatures? And what you're describing right here is God's primary objective is to secure the universe and preserve freedom of choice in that very process. And he's able to accomplish that through the means of the cross. And any other alternative path that we would sometimes prefer God to utilize, like immediately end, would just recreate the same kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Same kind of dynamics that would bring about rebellion again.
Yeah, I think that's right. I often invite my students, when they say, why did God do this or why doesn't God do that? I often invite them to ask, well, what other alternatives are available to God to accomplish that purpose? And if we think about it for a moment, we realize we don't know. Because we don't know all of the factors that God is dealing with. We don't know all the parameters involved. We only see a very small part of the picture. But I think we can look to the God of the cross and answer with conviction that if there had been any other way, that God who's willing to die for us, he would have chosen it. And just recognize we can trust him, and there's things beyond what we know, but we can trust his infinite wisdom and his infinite love.
Fantastic. Chaplain, you got the last thought. Anything you add to that?
I think for me, if that was asked of me, basically, for the believer, everything is based upon our faith. Not rationale, not reason. You're asking a very rational question. And so all of my arguments must rest on my faith. And my faith says that God says it will not rise a second time. That's number one. Secondly, one of my giants in strategic leadership is Peter Drucker. And he says only 3 things happens naturally in organizations, and the universe is an organization: friction, confusion, and underperformance. Everything else requires leadership. Friction will happen by itself. We will do that as a human race. Confusion by itself. Underperformance by itself. Leadership. God led from the beginning. He's the greatest strategic mind in the universe. And so the moment that the sin was committed in the heart of Lucifer, the crop was set and the plan of salvation was put in motion. And so he had to allow it to run the course. So lastly, I would offer you, direction is more important than speed. And so essentially, God knew that this sin problem, this hamartia thing, is going to take a minute. So he was not interested in the speed of it, but he was very interested, God was very interested in the direction of it, i.e. that it will move to a point where it will not die the second time, to the point where when God, Elohim in the Hebrew, the three of them came together and says, how are we going to get after this gulf fix? How are we going to get after reconciling man? And the three minds came together. And of course, one says, because I'm just, because I'm true, only the law is equal to the character and the justice of God himself. And so to reconcile God, to reconcile us back to God, God himself had to give up God. Hence the incarnation in the form of Jesus Christ. And so I have to believe, on the basis of my faith, that had it been another way, had it been another option, Christ would not have gone to the cross, but Christ did. And so I don't believe that it will rise the second time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Appreciate the answers and the questions from the answers and the questions from the questions. Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the greatest Jewish theologians and philosophers of our time, once wrote, "We are closer to God when we are asking questions than when we think we have the answers." It reminds us that the process of seeking can be just as important as finding. I look forward to the time when we will see Jesus face to face and get to ask him all of our questions. But on this side of heaven, let's go ahead and ask God those questions. Because if God is at the heart of those questions, he promises us in Jeremiah 29 verse 13, "You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart." And that promise gives me hope at night.